Secretary Tillerson is in Africa right now on his first trip to Africa. He's just probably leaving Ethiopia to go to Djibouti. He'll be going to Kenya, Chad, and Nigeria as well. And his visit is already being framed as one to combat China's pernicious influence on the continent. And so the couple of statements that he's made both in Addis Ababa and before he left were about this. And in his framing of the Chinese engagement as being quite negative for the continent, he also said that what the United States was going to do is give more humanitarian aid and some more money for good governance. And to me, it illustrates the difference between how we think, that we need to save Africa and we need to help them to be better because they're very naughty. And the Chinese are looking at it, they're saying, all right, we were pretty corrupt too. We still have a lot of challenges in that area, but that's not stopping us from doing economic development. And so they look at Africa like that as well.
Fascinating. I know that we had a short discussion to think about some of the topics, and we talked about a spark that ignites development. And I'm wondering if you could expand on what that means and what that concept is.
Absolutely. And this relates to why it is that I went to 50 Chinese factories in Africa and not 50 like restaurants or whatever. I mean, I have been to 50 restaurants in Africa, but you know what I mean. There is a certain magic to manufacturing, and it gets to your question, James, which is that manufacturing is a spark that ignites developing economies. And it historically happens when a cluster of manufacturing firms, and so let's start at the beginning. In Great Britain in the 18th century, they started weaving cotton and textiles. And these firms then became the best in the world. They were highly productive. And at a certain point, it caused labor prices to rise enough that it made sense for some of them to go elsewhere, such as America. And that sparks an industrial revolution in America. And the same thing happens. So at a certain point, labor costs and other things get high enough that it starts forcing them to leave. And so Japan is sort of the famous East Asian example in the 20th century that receives investment in part from the US and from Europe and industrializes, radically transforms itself. And the same thing happens in Japan, and those firms then land in the 4 Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea, and in turn sparks this transformation. And then they show up in China, right? 750 million people get lifted out of poverty in a single generation. It is the most that has ever happened, been lifted out of poverty in the history of the world. And that is the potential for Africa, that right now, China is hitting an inflection point. Labor prices have been rising more than 10% per year for the last decade. And these Chinese firms are seeing the writing on the wall that, hey, we can maybe hang on for a few more years, but at some point we've got to move, right? And to be fair, Africa is not the only place. So they're looking at Southeast Asia, they're looking at Bangladesh, they're looking at Central Asia. I met a man who's looking at Uzbekistan and Iran and Nigeria because, those are really similar countries. But a fair number of them are looking at Africa. And if Africa can become that next link in the chain, if it can receive a critical mass of this spark, the fire, so to speak, could be transformative for the continent.
And what those manufacturers need is power. So you can't have a factory that can produce at a competitive rate when they have to buy their own generators and buy diesel to run the generators, and they don't have electric power that's produced. And that's why I think it's interesting that we have a database of Chinese loans in Africa, and fully 40% of the loans in that database are going just to electric power, distribution lines and power production. And I read recently that for every 1,000 megawatts of power that's produced, it generates support for 800,000 jobs, which is really incredible to think about that. So direct and indirect. And so that's the kind of thing that when you put money into the power sector, you really are powering development.
Fascinating. And one other thing, people often ask me, China Institute is an organization that's educational, cultural. We've got a School of Chinese Studies, a gallery, I hope you'll take a look, and a Center for Business. And people often ask me, why does a nonprofit organization have a Center for Business? And just listening to this dialogue, the answer is because I believe that part of the culture of China, part of the DNA of Chinese culture is about business. And China, for many millennium, has been engaged in commerce, as all cultures have, but in an even more powerful way. That's just a sidetrack. When I was coming back, I was listening to you, and you, Deborah, talked a little bit about, or both of you actually, spoke a little bit about the American perspective, and Rex Tillerson being there, grounded in an aid perspective. That the way that we engage is by giving aid. You spoke a little bit, Irene, about the profit center, and that Chinese were going there to engage in manufacturing, which made me think about the concept of business runs through the DNA of Chinese culture. So we have two models here. One is engagement through profit, one is engagement through aid. And I wanted to know if there's a third model that might be sort of more organic, coming up from Africa itself. And is either one of these models the right way or the better way to look at engagement, and is there another way besides profit or aid?
Well, let me say that even though we often like to frame our engagement, particularly when the U.S. government is talking, we frame it as being one about aid. And I think Americans think about that. In actual fact, American companies have been investing in the natural resource sector, in particular in Africa. And it's interesting that Secretary Tillerson's company, Exxon, is one of the major investors in the oil sector. And they've invested in some pretty challenging countries. Equatorial Guinea comes to mind. Nigeria is another place where Exxon is big. I think they're also in Chad, aren't they? So we do have our businesses investing in the natural resource sector in Africa.
But is it true, would you say that we think about it as a framework about aid rather than doing business?
I think it's complex because even the U.S. government is different parts. And so there are parts of the government that are there for aid, USAID and other agencies like that. And then there are also parts that support business. But here is where the U.S. is such a pale shadow compared to what China does. For example, we were looking at the data recently coming out of our two main supports for business. One is the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and the other is OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And the amount of money that they've been putting into Africa, I think the last 2 years it was negligible for Exim Bank. It didn't even rise up to be counted because it was smaller than 100 million or something. And then for OPIC it was under 2 billion for this recent period. And if you compare that to the Chinese, for 2016 we have right now 18 billion just for 1 year in support. 12 billion of that is coming from the policy banks. Another 6 billion from banks like ICBC and other commercial banks and Chinese suppliers credits. So it's 18 billion coming in to support Chinese business, financed from China in just 1 year.
I guess what I would sort of add to this strain of conversation is that, I think we've got to think about the relationship in less simplistic terms. I mean, this is a system. It is not a, one thing happens that directly, it's not like a Rube Goldberg thing, that like one thing happens and it directly causes another thing, right? There's interplays in the system. And so when I think about, and I'll just raise an example. So I've been following this Chinese state-owned company called AVIC International for a long time. Deborah's reviewed a paper that I wrote about them and kindly published it at Scary. All friends with AVIC. But, they're a big Chinese conglomerate. They're one of the largest 200 companies in the world, actually. And they have a thriving business in Africa. And, one of the things that they started figuring out with the government of Kenya is that vocational education in Kenya is a huge need. And it's a huge societal need. Lots of, technical and vocational curricula are decades old and they need to be updated. The machinery that, if you think about technical skills, it often is like people learning how to operate complicated machinery. The machinery upon which they get trained on often is outdated. And so the Kenyan government, just as a normal matter of course, as any government, issues contracts to supply the equipment. And so AVIC got itself, it bid for the contracts, and it won some of those contracts. And so then in the course of supplying those contracts, it figured out, oh my God, the teachers teaching, machining, milling, right? The core technical stuff, the teachers don't know how to do this up to industry standards in Kenya. So then because of that, they went ass backwards into the business of thinking about how would you train a technically sophisticated modern workforce that is up to the standards of industry, right? And I just give that example because I think the relationship between public goods and business is often more intertwined and more dynamic than we give it credit for. And one of the things that I've often observed is that it often takes some business going into a developing economy, and that has ripple effects. That creates pressures for change in this system, and that firm finds allies and sometimes enemies in government or civil society that creates further ripple effects and desire forces for further change, which then has an effect on the private sector, giving it more of an incentive or more of a pressure to invest more or trade more or develop in one direction or another. And then this cycle, right? And so this is a dynamic system. It's complicated, but that's what makes it really interesting.
Okay, I was just going to say that one of the things that we think about when we think about engagement and what we've touched on here, and don't worry, I'm going to open it up because I do want this to be an interactive discussion, and I'm sure lots of you in the audience have things that you'd like to ask and become interactive, and we can only touch on some of the subjects. But I think one thing that's become apparent, if you have a profit motive engaged at a commercial basis, on the one hand, it's going to be a spark that ignites further development and has lots of positive byproducts that are really not political in nature, they're basically economic. The question I think that we sometimes have an overlay about, particularly when we talk about Africa, where the regulatory environment is not as developed, when you don't have a long history of the same kind of engage in business ethics that we do in Western Europe and America, if allowed to run amok, what is the responsibility of the private sector to come in and, frankly, is it their responsibility, and do the local host countries have the capacity to regulate and steer so that it doesn't become a brush fire but becomes an engine for growth?
I think that what we have in the West, China, Africa, is places that are at different stages of development. And what's happened in the West is that we have come to a point where we don't find corruption to be acceptable, and so we put laws in place against foreign corruption. We did it in 1977 in America. Europe did it 20 years later with a lot of lobbying from the US in 1997. It's now 20 years after that. And China has its own law like that, but it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. And so I think and in African countries, by and large, there isn't as much regulatory enforcement against corruption as we would like. But these things are processes, and I think that it's good to push for that. But it's not. But it's not good to just say development has to wait until those things get in place. Another way of looking at it is that they emerge out of economic growth, not that they're prerequisites for it.
Absolutely, and just to illustrate that point, in the U.S., we prided ourselves on having better worker safety laws than, for example, in China. But, you know, when you look at some of the landmark labor safety laws and how they came into being in the US, I think about the example of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory here in New York City, and how those women who died, so this was, for those who aren't familiar, this happened in the early 20th century. There's a big factory that burned down with hundreds of female workers inside and children, and those same women had been lobbying, picketing for better working conditions. And it took their death before the public took enough notice and there was enough pressure on the state government and the city government to actually put some of the first worker safety laws in place in the US. And obviously, I'm not saying that that needs to happen for societies to put sensible protective laws in place for workers, but it just shows you how, you know, I think it's easy for us in this era to think that, you know, oh, like we've got it figured out, why can't they just do this? But it's not like the US was like particularly good about protecting workers. And it's a dynamic cycle of change, right? Where countries hopefully will do their best beforehand to have the right regulations in place, and that is something they should work on. But business will go in, and then stuff will happen, and people will figure it out and reset and make things better, and then business will do more, and then governments will have to do more, right? Like, it's a co-development process, to Deborah's point.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up now. I just wanted to add one comment. We've touched upon the word corruption several times here. For those of you who are interested in the impact of corruption on development, I encourage you to look up a work that was done by Kishore Mahbubani, who's the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, and he equates corruption with cancer. And so nobody thinks cancer is a good thing, and when cancer takes over your body, it can kill you. But there are also kinds of cancers that you can live with that are benign and that grow with you. And he also says take advantage. You know, corruption is also in some ways a lubricant in some developing economies. And he was particularly has a case example in Bangkok, the Suvarnabhumi Airport, which said we can document up and down many kinds of instances where the Western world would come in and label this corruption. All kinds of different business agreements that would be unacceptable in a Western context. But 6 years later, after the place was built, it's up and running, functional, and somehow the airport in its gleaming glory works just fine, or works well enough, despite that. So just put your attention to that. So now I'd like to turn it over. I'm sure there's tons of questions. So I'll start back, right, left, right. Why don't we start with this lovely lady in the red first?
Deborah, you mentioned that.
Can you identify yourself first?
Yeah, if you just,
My name's Renee Cho.
and if you have any organizational affiliation.
I'm a blogger for the Earth Institute.
Can she get a mic because it's hard to hear? Or can you repeat the question, please?
Sorry. Hold it close to you.
My name's Renee Cho, and I'm a blogger for the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And you mentioned that 40% of the loans are going to energy, and I read a disturbing thing that while China is trying to close a lot of their coal power plants, they're building a lot of them in Africa. And I was wondering if they're making any attempt to do some of the energy that is needed there with renewable energy, or is it all coal? What are your thoughts?
I was just looking at, we took a subset out of just the power sector loans, and I believe there were 6 coal power plants that were financed. By far, it's hydropower, and then we have a smaller amount of geothermal and solar, but and then some gas-fired, natural gas. That's pretty much it. But not as many coal as you might think. But I also think it's an interesting dilemma. You know, obviously, we think we're really against coal. My parents come down from Maine and demonstrate in Washington against coal. So we have, you know, on Capitol Hill, there's a coal-fired power plant. But, and we have an administration right now who loves coal. So it's interesting times with regard to coal, unfortunately.
Go to the front row, and then we'll work our way back.
Thank you for,
Try this one. And can you identify yourself?
yes, Richard Black with the Schiller Institute. Thank you for all the insights. A comment and a question. The comment is, when President Xi talks about what's China's real plan. He always talks about win-win. I think it's very important to understand. And when he's lecturing to students, he talks about Confucius and Mencius and the idea of the benefit of the other. So when we talk about a special East Asian approach, it's very difficult for Westerners to actually understand what China really is interested in. My question is this, in terms of joint national investment among several nations in Africa. In Abuja last week, there was a conference on recharging Lake Chad, and Italy announced that it will work with Howard China to jointly finance the study for the building of the man-made river to rebuild Lake Chad. So here you have a China-Italy collaboration, and when the new president of France, Macron, was in China, he, number one, apologized for the crimes of France during the colonial period, and then he said, we're in on the Belt and Road. What do you see the prospects are of, for instance, French-Chinese collaboration around the kind of development you both described?
Yeah, this one. Okay. That's a great point, and there is interest, I'd say, more from the European side than the American side in figuring out how it can work with China in third countries, and I wouldn't limit this to Africa. I would say Central Asia, Southeast Asia are other huge arenas, particularly with the rise of Belt and Road as a mega initiative. And you see this amongst the European countries of figuring out, speaking of business, hey, there's French construction firms, there's British engineering firms, there's good German equipment makers, and when you talk about building a global trade superhighway that stretches from the tip of Europe and the tip of Africa to the tip of Southeast Asia, there's a lot of opportunities for everybody, right? And so I think people get that conceptually, and we hear that a lot in my client work at McKinsey, where people are trying to figure out from developed countries how they can meaningfully participate in these big mega projects that China is spearheading. And there's this sea shift, right? China's set up not one, but 200 billion development banks in the last few years, right? This is the biggest reordering in global development that has happened since Bretton Woods. And so there's a lot of things shifting and a lot of opportunities for everybody. And I think the way to think about it is that there are things that Western firms and Western governments, experiences, investments, expertise, that they come to the table with that China doesn't have. And when I talk to Chinese government officials, they certainly recognize that. And they use the term trilateral cooperation. So trilateral meaning China, the West, and whatever region they happen to be talking about. In my case, I'm usually talking about Africa, but they mean that also for developing countries in Asia as well.
I like to see this trilateral cooperation happening through market mechanisms, because I think, at least as far as U.S. and China and Africa cooperation has happened, there's been very little that's been at the official level. But let me give you an example of unofficial cooperation that's working very well, and that's in Ethiopia, where there's a very large, there are a number of Chinese factories that we both have visited there. And those Chinese factories were in part introduced to Ethiopia through American companies that were buying shoes in China. And the American company, Brown Shoes, was one of them, scouted out other locations where they thought the cost of production could be cheaper, because they were driving the cost down and it was getting too high. And so it was Brown that brokered in part the introduction of the Chinese shoe factories into Ethiopia so that they could have a cheaper supply chain source there. And that was all done through the market.
Excuse me. Let's move towards the middle back. How about this gentleman here with the... Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, so David Hull. I'm a consultant. In fact, it's interesting you to mention ABIC. In a prior life, they were a client of mine.
Everybody's friends with
I will draw a discreet veil over that. Listening to you, very importantly, you raise the issue of private enterprise. But I'm mindful of Robinson and Gallagher's theory of informal empire as part of the British Empire. Everybody's looking at the parts that the flag was on, and not countries like Argentina, Iran, and indeed China, which Britain influenced, controlled from an economic point of view, for reasons of power and payback. So I just wonder if you could spend some moments on the government. What's in it for the Chinese government in terms of this type of economic activity?
Well, the Chinese government is very interested in outward engagement. And there are a couple of ways in which we can see this. One is it's, of course, interested, as I've been saying over and over, in supporting its companies as they go out and become global champions. And there are many ways in which the government does that. But I do think China is interested in figuring out what it means to be a global stakeholder, a global power. And Africa has been, in some ways, a testing ground for that. One issue that hasn't come up at all is China's role as in the security sector in Africa. So you have, for example, Chinese peacekeepers. They have a pretty large contingent. The first armed Chinese peacekeepers went to South Sudan. There were a few in Mali as well. But that's the biggest area where I think the Chinese provide as many, or they're one of the largest providers of peacekeepers to the United Nations. Compared to, we do a lot of funding, but we don't supply people. So that's interesting, and that's part of, I think, their seeing themselves as a responsible power who provides more than they used to in the past and steps up to the plate. Now, this can also be seen, a lot of people are quite worried about this. We talked about port. Djibouti is where China has its first, what some people call a naval base, some people call a logistics port. But the Chinese Navy will be resupplying at Djibouti, and it's very close to the U.S. base there. So we're quite concerned about what this actually means for China's development of its abilities overseas to project force. And that's a whole area that we haven't gotten into.
Yeah, and the dimension that I'll add to this in response to your question is, it's helpful, just as we've been trying to disaggregate China's business activities by sector, by type of company, by ownership, it's helpful to disaggregate the Chinese state a little bit as well, because it is a complicated ecosystem. And there's a couple of just, quick thoughts on dimensions. So oftentimes Beijing is not, people care what Beijing thinks, but the provinces and the municipalities have their own things that they want, right? And oftentimes they're pushing their own firms, oftentimes they're pushing their own agenda. Oftentimes they have relationships with African countries of their own. So when the governor of Guangdong province shows up in Ethiopia, he is treated like a head of state, right? In terms of the way they think about the people. He meets the prime minister. He meets every official he wants to meet. He brings a business delegation from Guangdong province. And so, there's an ecosystem kind of beyond Beijing of the Chinese state. There are giant institutions. So China Development Bank, China Exim Bank. There's the new Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which does less in Africa, but when you think about Belt and Road covering Asia as well, and the bureaucrats there, we can talk in Bavarian terms about the interests of the bureaucracy, right, which are often different than the interests of the politicians, and that whole ecosystem exists. And so, I want us to just sort of, complexify our thinking about, because I feel like we use the term China, and we've got to problematize it a little bit, because it's such a big country, there are so many parts, and they're all kind of doing a little bit different things sometimes.
And I would add, it's not that dissimilar. We work with the U.S. National Governors Association, and many U.S. governors in reverse are going to bring delegations to China to, attract investment into their state or to increase exports. So in many ways, one of the things I say is China behaves increasingly like the rest of the world, not that much different. let's move to back, this gentleman right here.
Where is, okay, there you go. Want to hand that over, please? Identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Jamie Fleischman, and I work at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and talking a lot about economic growth, and curious to talk a little bit more about growth in the social sector, maybe particularly with education and nonprofits. Obviously, there's been a lot of work in the West over the last few decades in this area, and China, given that within China, there's not as much, but increasingly growing amount of work in the social sector. I'm curious how that translates to work in Africa, and because has a chance to sort of go back to the drawing board and maybe do it in a new approach, I'm wondering what that might look like. Thank you.
Sure, it's a very good question, and your question reminds me of one of the people that I met in researching this book. His name, for those that speak Chinese, it's such an odd name. His name is Zhiran.
His real name.
That is actually his real name. And there's this whole backstory, which I don't tell in the book because it's like, while entertaining, not like really like supporting any anything that I want to say. But his dad went through a fight actually with the local authorities to actually put Ziran on his birth certificate. And they were naturally like, but Zira is not a surname. And he's like, what kind of anyway, whatever. He won that battle, and his name is Ziran. And he is a Chinese man about my age that lives in Kenya. And he has sort of founded a series, he and a lot of his friends actually have founded a series of, tiny micro NGOs and sort of personal initiatives in figuring out, different needs, responding to different needs. They want to be helpful citizens in Kenya. Right, and they're not Kenyan citizens, they're still Chinese, but they very much see themselves as people who are living long-term in Kenya. They're investing in that society, they're investing of themselves, and they're engaged civically and societally. And they're also wrestling with what it means to be Chinese still and living in Kenya for the long term. And that's not always easy for them, right? And one of the things that, in Sudan, like lots of Chinese people our age, is pretty tech savvy, right? And so he starts this WeChat page, and he starts, publishing his own and other people's feelings on this, right? And so part of it is that he's building linkages to local Kenyan communities by, for example, volunteering and organizing donations for Kenyan schools, him and his friends. But he's also wrestling with building community in the Chinese and Africa community and trying to build that up and building meaning there. And so you just see this really interesting development of, these young people. There are young Chinese. I interview a lot of like old stodgy factory bosses in their like 50s and 60s with like their pot bellies or whatever and their long pinky nails. There's also these young Chinese people in Africa who are they're not millennials, they're older than millennials, the ones that I know at least. But they're our age, they're tech connected, they're modern people, and they're trying to figure out, how do I be Chinese African? How do I contribute meaningfully? They very much look up to the Western NGO social-minded model, but they're trying to adapt that for the people that they are in the society that they live in.
No, I'm just conscious of the time, and I know there's a lot of questions. If you guys are all right, can we engage maybe one or two more questions, even though our time is up? So let me move to, go ahead, one of the gentlemen in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Arsene Oka. I'm from Cote d'Ivoire. And currently I'm a financial economics major at Columbia University, trying to find a new career after I ended my professional soccer career.
Wow. Soccer career? Wow.
So, thank you for this event. I would like to thank China, not officially, but my contribution. Because in 2000, I was still in Ivory Coast, and I witnessed when some of the first Chinese business people came to Ivory Coast. they started with some food trucks in the streets. And we saw how 10 years or 20 years later, from these small businesses, they ended up owning some hotels and some restaurants. And currently, many of these business people are training some Ivorians how to start small. So I think that business is the only way to go, and AIDS kills the economy. This is not a secret. So my question is, would you have a transfer of technology to the manufacturing that you are bringing in Africa? Because it's the transfer of technology that helped Japan, South Korea, and all these countries. Thank you.
And also I would add help China. So when China was developing, one of the major components of US and Western European, one of the conditions for engagement was transfer of technology. But China was very sophisticated about putting together a set of regulations and benefits to attract that component.
This is a question that concerns, I think, all of us who look at the manufacturing sector. It's wonderful that the Chinese companies are coming over and they are employing a lot of Africans. And some Africans are being employed at higher levels, certainly in human resources, and and some are getting technical training. But what I haven't seen a lot of yet is really technology transfer. People from the Chinese, the workforce in the Chinese factories, the African workforce starting their own factories, and that kind of dissemination going on. And that's what happened in Asia. It wasn't just the foreign investors who came into China or into the Four Tigers. They started it, they kick-started it, but then it was local people who carried on the industrialization. And I think they're anecdotes, and we're going to be talking about some of them tomorrow. If you're in Washington, we're having a panel at site. We're both going to do that. So, but I think that's a hard nut to crack.
Yeah, and you from Côte d'Ivoire, I'll just use that to introduce a little bit some of the research that we've been doing at McKinsey, which is, we did this very large scale on the ground in-person survey of more than 1,000 Chinese firms already operating in Africa. And that, just to give everybody a sense of proportion, there are about more than 10,000 Chinese firms operating in Africa today. So we went and talked to more than 1,000 of them. And one of the countries that we went to was Côte d'Ivoire. And there, in country after country, so by the time we showed up and pitched in Côte d'Ivoire, we had gone in several other countries already. And so we had the experience of looking at the Chinese Ministry of Commerce data, and it's saying, there's 100 Chinese firms in Kenya or whatever. And then going to the Kenyan government, and the Kenyan government is like, oh, there's 200 Chinese firms, and we match them up, right? And then we go on the ground and we chat a bunch of people, and take a bunch of people out to dinner, and then it snowballs, and we get a list. So in Kenya, there ended up being 400 Chinese firms, right? So it's always 2 times, 3 times what any of the governments think there are. In Côte d'Ivoire, there were 9 times the number of Chinese firms as recorded by either government. It just blew us away, right? And we were already used to multiples, and in Côte d'Ivoire, it just totally blew us away, just how quickly, to your point, this had developed. But to Deborah's point and your point, there is a lot that hasn't been done yet. And one of the things that we found out is that when you look at the suppliers of Chinese firms in Africa and the value of the supplies that the firms are actually using, less than half are coming from local African firms, right? And when we talk about Japan and China itself and how it used foreign investment as a spark, a lot of the mechanism how that happened is by having foreign firms actually source from local suppliers. And that is a huge opportunity for Africa. The good news is when we talk to these Chinese firms, they want to source more from local firms because every firm wants a shorter supply chain, right? But there's barriers in the way. Oftentimes the African local suppliers are subscale. they need some investment, they need some new technology, right? So to get that going, to get them to take advantage of that opportunity, there needs to be some effort and some funding and some investment. But there's a matchup there that's possible, and I'd like to see African governments do a lot more in providing loan packages, SME type of programs, entrepreneurship training programs to help those local firms actually scale up to serve these more productive, more value-added value chains.
I know there's lots of questions. Look, how maybe we just take one more question. Who did I not get to? Right here. Go ahead.
My name is Noah Gita. Thank you guys for coming tonight. I'm Ugandan American, so I'm kind of split. My parents have always said China's been helping Africa develop, but as an American, some of the way that China governs its people, I'm afraid that it will be transferred to Africa. And as a Ugandan, as a president who's there for 30 years, I'm scared that this business won't actually help us develop, because investment can bring roads and it can bring railways, but it won't sustain these investments. The government has to be more inclusive for our people. So I want to hear your opinion on how does this investment affect our governance?
That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of people have been very interested in. And let me have another moment of advertising. We're on the 19th and 20th of April. We're having a conference just on this issue about the politics of Chinese engagement in Africa. What kind of impact is it having? We have a lot of wonderful people coming, so it's open to the public and free.
Where?
At SICE in Washington. Johns Hopkins site. Whining. You can all come. Just register beforehand at our website. But I think that there's a lot of concern because China is an authoritarian government, communist as well. There's concern that China legitimizes this kind of authoritarian continuity. And what we just heard from the constitutional changes that have been agreed upon in China, that Xi Jinping will not be bound by the term limits that were in place before, creates even greater worries, I think. And there have been a lot of problems with African leaders, like the one in Uganda, not stepping down with 70. And so these are challenges. I do think it's a legitimate concern, and China does represent a model that is probably problematic. This idea that one person has to stay in power to keep the country together and they can't allow for transition to another person. I thought it was working a lot better when they had term limits and that this was agreed upon, because I don't think it's the case that the whole country needs one person to keep them together. Maybe Ethiopia did. At least when Melis died, I was quite worried, but that's a joke.
Yeah, and I was just in Ethiopia when the Prime Minister resigned a couple of weeks ago. That's quite a shock because we still don't know what will happen. I mean, I don't know Uganda well. I've only been there on holiday. Well, it's a holiday in case anybody's looking for their next vacation. But, you know, with regards to your question, I think it is a deeply meaningful one that every African country has to engage for it to solve. And I guess, you know, you're Ugandan American, I'm Chinese American, right? And so I value the fact that I can vote here, but I also see how it's not the only way to run society, right? And I tend to agree with Deborah that term limits work pretty well for China over the last generation, right? But, you know, electoral politics is also not the only way, and I think we've got to stop thinking in those binaries. And I want to point out also that in many societies in Africa, there are actually, there are levers, there are institutions that don't exist in China. So, for example, in Nigeria, you know, there is a rowdy press. And, you know, there's a case in my book that I cover where the press is the one that points out this deeply corrupt deal between a state government and a Chinese business, right? And exposes that and creates the public pressure for that to be fixed. And so there are ways that people just, so every society has sort of its own set of checks and balances. And I think there's some soul searching to be done in every African country of thinking about what is the right model and how is that right balance achieved. I don't pretend like China has figured out the answer for that, but the Chinese answer shouldn't be what the African answer is.
So I wish we could go on and on. We've already gone over by about 20 minutes. Before I thank our guests, if you're interested in the subject, I encourage you. The Next Factory of the World is available, and you can engage yourself reading it. But I just want to say a big, big thank you to our guests for coming in, to Deborah. Thank you so much for joining us. A lot more for us to think about.
That's good.